Welcome to Process Better, the latest Beyond Clean series where we dive deep into the workflows, best practices, and innovations that drive excellence in sterile processing. From point-of-use cleaning to set assembly, inventory intelligence, and beyond, we're tackling the biggest challenges in surgical services with real, actionable solutions. Each episode, we'll break down the details, challenge the status quo, and help you refine your process for better outcomes. Process Better is proudly sponsored by Medline. More than a medical supplier, we make healthcare run better. And now, sit back and stay tuned as we explore what it takes to improve, innovate, and process better. Every instrument, every time. All right, Sterile Processing Universe, you're listening to the Process Better podcast sponsored by Medline. I'm your host, Bobby Parker from Beyond Clean, and today we're switching things up on you a little bit. In episode 4 of this 5-part series, we are talking about inventory intelligence. From excellence in case cart picking to expired supplies, we're taking a hard look at the surgical supply network in your facility. Now, whether that happens in the sterile processing department, gets picked by the OR in a core, or gets picked by the supply chain team, there's a lot of complexity that goes into making sure that's done both with high degree of quality for our patients and being done efficiently with minimal waste for the sake of the budget. So lots to talk about. We're bringing in an expert from Medline today to talk about this topic with us. So hang tight. We'll be right back for the interview. Joining us now in studio is Tracy Smith, National Market Director at Medline. Tracy, welcome to the show. Excited to be talking about this topic with you today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today.
For sure. Now, I mentioned to you before we got on the call, this podcast series has been a lot of fun so far, talking with Tori over the last couple of weeks. So you've got some big shoes to fill. Tori did a great job. We've been primarily talking about instrument reprocessing and kind of the different processes throughout the workflow that we could work on improving, building good collaborative culture with our operating room. But today we're talking about a topic that doesn't get as much attention on Beyond Clean, and it probably should. And that's the topic of single-use disposable inventory of supplies, all the things that we need to make sure our sterile processing departments and our ORs are running well. So before we jump into that topic, Tracy, I'd love if you could introduce yourself to our audience and maybe tell us a little bit about your background and how that has interfaced with surgical supplies over the years.
Absolutely. So my name's Tracy Smith. As mentioned, I'm the National Market Director for Medline, working in our clinical solutions team. I've been in the medical industry for about 20 years. I started out working in tissue banking, where I did a lot of work with Joint Commission standards, tissue banking standards, and tissue tracking. And then more recently moved into more of the distribution segment of the business. And so did a lot of work with just how supplies move from a warehouse or a distributor to an actual hospital. And then that kind of morphed into, looking at things like workflow, supply efficiencies, and just overall how supplies are utilized in the perioperative and sterile processing areas.
Okay, so you've done a little bit of thinking about this topic. It sounds like from from a number of different roles. So, well, that's great because inventory management in sterile processing and in the OR is complex. It's not the same in any two places, and so it'll be fun diving into some of that nuance together. Kind of at a high level as we're starting this conversation, could you walk us through maybe what are some of the different models that you've seen out there for supply management for sterile processing departments? Of course, many of them that I've been don't even handle the supplies that are used in surgery, others on the far other end of the spectrum. So what are kind of the different options that you've seen out in the field?
So it's really interesting when you're looking at sterile processing and supply management as it relates to an SPD area or an OR area. Sometimes you'll see that those supplies are kind of stored in separate spaces. You may have some supplies in the OR space that are more managed by clinicians. You may have SPD type supplies managed by the sterile processing team. And then you have supply chain involved as well. So there's a lot of different people who touch the supplies and may have an impact on how those supplies are used. So when I talk about just looking at the perioperative space and the SPD areas, you think about supplies working in a linear fashion in certain areas of the hospital. But in the perioperative space, we're really looking at a non-linear process. There's a lot of different supplies being pulled in and out based on case pick, based on just, the kind of structure of the facility, who's touching the supplies, and it can get really complicated.
Sure. When you say a kind of a circular workflow, is that referring to supplies that are maybe being returned back to sterile processing from the OR and trying to manage that? Okay. So yeah. I'm getting some nods. Yes. Okay, great. So
yes.
So that highlights some complexities, right, to managing inventory in sterile processing. And so at the top of the conversation here, could maybe you underline or highlight some KPIs, some of those key performance indicators, some data that we should be aware of kind of at the front end of this conversation that we can talk through as we talk about supplies?
Absolutely. So I think when you're talking about inventory in this space, you're really looking at ways you can minimize cost. You want to keep your inventory lean and pay attention to substitutions and overstock. And as mentioned, there's a lot of complexity here with who's touching the supplies and who's utilizing the supplies. So it can get a little complicated. So you also need to really think about product accuracy and making sure that you understand what the products are and where they live, kind of their locations in the space. That can be related to things like looking at what's on your preference cards, understanding a rack location, bin location where supply lives on the shelf, or even just trying to understand substitutions and duplicate type supplies. So those are things to think about when you talk about supply management. But from a specific KPI standpoint, the first thing that I always talk about is you should look at the inventory in the department and look at your inventory turnover rates. So how quickly are your teams using supplies and how often are they replenished? And that kind of gives you an idea of, okay, do we have way too much inventory that we're overstocked, right? Or are we just completely, understocked and we're stocking out of supplies?
Yeah, that's really helpful as we think through how much of each thing to keep on hand. I'm sure somewhere in there, par levels are going to come into this conversation as we're looking at those usage levels. But then also how many things are getting handled and moved around and put back and never used. I'm sure like a return rate is something that you would want to look at as well. That's something that I've spent probably more time than any of the other KPIs thinking about. The department that I led, Tracy, was one that leaned on a supply chain to pull the supplies for the operating room. We were primarily pulling instruments, but that number of trays sent back to sterile processing unopened was something that kept me up at night, thinking about all the labor that went into getting that tray or that supply pulled, that it was checked in the OR, it ended up back to us, ends up back on the shelf, and then creates all kinds of risk about the package being damaged or opened. What does success look like with some of these KPIs, particularly that returned supplies number? Like, is there a standard that every department should be looking for or looking to try to meet, or is it different depending on every organization's unique situation?
I think it's different depending on every organization's situation because it depends on who's doing the case pick for the hospital, kind of who's managing the supplies, how much are the clinicians involved, things that you don't think about, things like preference cards and whether or not those are accurate or not. And if you're pulling some of the supplies from an SPD area, are you pulling supplies from kind of an OR core area? Like all of that has an effect on how the supplies move. So, I think when we kind of go back to like the turnover rate, but you talk about like stock outs of supplies. Are you using the supplies? Are you running out? When you're picking cases, is there case card accuracy? Like kind of tracking that and understanding, are you picking the right supplies? Are they in the right places? And then, managing expirations too. Those are all things we talk about. So
sure. So that case cart piece of it is one that I'd like to explore a little bit more, because that's the big debate in the industry, at least when you talk to a sterile processing manager, is who's going to pick all the supplies and the instruments for the case cart? Who's going to be responsible for that? How do we get those pieces put together effectively? And in a lot of places, as you alluded to, you've got multiple departments contributing to that case cart, maybe with sterile processing picking instruments, or maybe the OR is the one picking the instruments and supplies coming from another department. So is there a best practice that you've found for who and even when these case carts should be picked by and picked for, or what have you found that works well?
So I think the first thing to keep in mind is that clinicians are looking at supply needs very differently and through kind of a different lens than maybe your supply chain or SPD teams are, right? And so it's really important to make sure that you're defining communication processes between all the different teams. So there are no surprises, that you're not missing any supplies or there's not inaccuracies, and understanding, what do you do in an urgent situation if you don't have the supplies you need? So I think the first thing and most important thing is making sure that you understand that the preference cards really drive case cards and the way kind of the process works. So if your preference cards are inaccurate, that kind of drives everything else. And you're going to see some challenges within the teams as to who's doing what. The other thing that I think is really important is taking a step back and looking at where supplies live in the space and does it make sense? So when you think about like high demand items that you're using all the time for the majority of cases, those should be in a central location and should be picked by your supply chain team or SPD team. That should be really who's picking the main bulk of the case. When you're looking at things like physician preference items, specialty items, that's really where you want your clinicians involved. And those supplies really should be located somewhere more conveniently located to the OR. Because you think about, the goal is you want your clinicians working at the top of their license. So they should really be working with patients. And your technicians and supply chain teams, they're the ones who should be working with inventory. So you really want to make sure you're placing your supplies in an area that makes sense for supply chain to manage and pick and be involved in the main portion of that case pick process. And then you want your clinicians to just kind of pick the specialty things as needed.
You mean we don't need more RNs picking supplies before surgery? You don't say. Right.
But it happens, right? More often than not, it happens.
Yeah. And I understand the motivation behind it, because our surgical techs, our OR nurses in the room with the physician, they just want it to be right for their patients. They certainly don't want to be in the room where the fourth case for the day has gone wrong with having everything that was needed. And so when you have those preference cards that are maybe not the best, and it depends on kind of the local institutional knowledge, the tribal knowledge of, I need to add this supply because this doctor prefers this one over the other one, or positions the patient this way. And that's not replicatable by a supply chain team or a sterile processing team. You almost have no choice but to have those who are deeply embedded in that process, your RNs, your surgical techs, to be doing those case cards. So yeah, long way of saying preference cards are really important for sure. I
think preference cards drive everything. I mean, really and truly, if you think about it, they're really the indicator of what supplies need on the shelf, who's picking what, where it should be located. Like that really should be a high priority for a supply chain team.
So I want to position you right in the middle of a big debate that goes on in the industry around the timing of case cart picking. So those who are really big fans of Lean Six Sigma and reducing waste are often big proponents of just-in-time picking. Let's have as many of the supplies already sterilized, already taken care of in sterile processing, provide that cart just in time, and not like use up all of our floor space, pulling it, 2 days ahead of time and dealing with all the add-ons. On the other side, there's a lot of advantages, particularly for sterile processing, of building out those case carts way ahead of time. Do you have an ideal of the case cart process for surgery and what you think would be something that would be beneficial for departments to work towards in terms of the timing of picking case carts?
We usually recommend that case cards get pulled a day before. So that gives you time to really make sure you have everything you need to pull the trays, pull the supplies, make sure everything's there. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be some type of oversight or some kind of conversation earlier in the week about the case as well. Because, if there is a specialty item that has to be ordered in, or you've got a tray that's a specialty item that a rep needs to bring in or something like that, like you really want to make sure that somebody has their eyes on that case, maybe a week in advance or, a number of days ahead of time to give you some time to kind of work through that. But then actually picking the case itself, we usually recommend 24 hours in advance.
That's generally what we see around the industry as well. And so thanks for sharing that. I was just curious, maybe you were one of the just-in-time radicals out there, because there's some really interesting case cart processes that I've seen where people have taken a pretty radical approach to picking case carts. So one more thing on case carts before we keep moving, because I know this is about supplies and we have a lot more to get to. That has to do with preference cards are important. We both doubled down on that. I think everybody in the industry would agree with that. The difficult part is, how do we go about actually getting those updated? Do you have any advice for a department that maybe has all of their RNs pulling cases and their preference cards are a disaster? What are some of those first couple of steps that you can take to get those preference cards under control?
Well, there's a couple different ways you can look at it. There are some preference card management products out there that can help you streamline and be more directed in actually managing the preference cards themselves. So that's always a good thing to take a look at. I think the thing that's really challenging when it comes to cases, picking cases, you had mentioned the clinician in the room is dealing with a surgeon, something's missing. It's a very emotional conversation, right? Like you don't want to be the one that's being yelled at because something's not there. And so it becomes a very emotional conversation of trying to make sure you have what you need. So you usually over prepare for the worst case scenario, right? When you start really getting into preference cards and preference cards management solutions, the goal really is to have more data behind it so that you can better understand what really is being used and when. So that would probably be my key thing, would be to start looking at something like that, where you have some actual data to look at versus just the emotional, conversation that a nurse or a clinician is having because of their day.
Yeah, that's so huge. And it definitely contributes to the conversation we had earlier about the volume of unused supplies being returned back to sterile processing and supply chain. If all of them are being pulled as a safety blanket because of one event that happened 3 years ago, and we just never want that to happen again, when we could have just positioned that as a resource right outside that room as a just in case and not had it travel back and forth and touch so many hands. So yeah, I think that's really great advice. While we're talking about the data piece of it, looking at the supplies that are required, you had mentioned using that to evaluate how many of each kind of supply that you wanted. Talk us through par level management and what are some of the basic concepts to keep in mind as you're figuring out how many supplies or even how many instrument sets to keep on hand.
I think when you talk about PAR management, it's just really important to be very mindful of what's on the shelf. So, your PAR level is your ideal quantity on hand based on usage. And depending on your facility, how busy you are, if you're a level 1 trauma center, things like that, you may need to have more stock than maybe a smaller facility would. But you want to think about things like reorder points, usage rates. Do you want to have 2 days of inventory on hand? Do you need to have 3 days of inventory on hand? Some of that is related to whether or not you have a delivery of supplies coming every day. Is your delivery of supplies coming every other day? So a lot of that will be things that you'll be thinking about when you're looking at PAR level management. I also have, customers we work with that have safety stock for really critical items that they know are difficult to get. They may have kind of like an overstock room where they'll keep certain things. And I think the other thing too is thinking about just some principles like first in, first out, making sure that you're rotating your stock, making sure you're auditing what's actually being used. Do you have the right supplies? Do you have duplications of supplies? Those are all things to think about. And like I mentioned, lead time is really important because The OR space, you're not only getting supplies from your distributor, but you more than likely have specialty items that are coming direct from the vendors, that are coming via FedEx or UPS. You've got a lot of things that are kind of coming in and out, and you really need to pay attention to what those lead times look like, because that'll have a huge effect on your cases.
Yeah, and you don't want to be delaying cases because we didn't realize how long something was going to take to arrive. I feel like if COVID taught us anything, it's that at a moment's notice, something that's very critical to healthcare can all of a sudden become not available, and we're going to have to get very creative about
Right.
how we solve that problem. I remember in kind of those early days, and particularly right after, a very big shift happening in supply chain, thinking through how much do we want to try to keep on hand, and kind of the propensity to overstock and be able to be prepared. Have you seen any of that continue and persist all the way into 2025, where maybe we're keeping a little bit too much on hand just in case something were to happen?
Absolutely. There's no question. I think that's actually probably one of the biggest challenges, is that we go into facilities, we get asked to look at workflow and to help, understand PAR optimization. And more often than not, hospitals have way too much inventory. And, part of it is it's COVID and just, kind of dealing with the pandemic. Part of it is some of the back orders and challenges we've had with supplies. So, just being in front of that. And then I think also too, it's sometimes there's a lot of difficulty in actually having visibility to what's on the shelf and what's in the perioperative space. Again, talking about the circular supply or circular inventory processes, managing the returns, managing the specialty carts, just where all these different places that supplies can live gets really challenging. And so if you're not really on top of the processes, you can really have situations where you're going to have more inventory than you need. And then what do? You can't always send that back to the manufacturer or your vendor. So you're kind of stuck with it. And it just becomes this vicious cycle. So it can get really challenging.
Well, and depending on the shelf life of whatever it is that you're hanging on to, it very well could end up expiring right on the shelf and it never gets used,
yes.
which I know has been and will continue to be a major issue in supply chain in hospitals. Yes. How do we address the issue of expired supplies in like a cost-effective and labor-efficient manner without having the frontline employees just digging through every supply every month to make sure it's not going to expire on us?
Well, I think it's really a multifaceted approach. Like, you really have to think about some different tools that you could potentially use. There are some different technologies out there with like barcode scanning, RFID scanning that can help with just streamlining the process. I think it's really important to make sure your staff is well trained, that they understand first in, first out principles. And, as a supply chain leader or a clinical leader, to do everything you can to try to standardize what products are on the shelf. The less duplication you have equals the less waste. And like we talked about, that's a big thing that I think a lot of hospitals are dealing with, is they might have the same type of supply in 4 different locations in their SPD or OR. And, it's pretty much guaranteed something's going to expire because of that.
Yeah, no doubt. Before we move to close this conversation, because I want to make sure that we turn the corner and give some real practical advice for departments that are struggling with all the issues we're talking about in terms of overstock, expired products, messed up preference cards. But before we do that, you've piqued my curiosity as we've been talking about expired products, talking about overstocking, and particularly back orders, which is every supply chain leader's probably least favorite word to hear. What is it like dealing with a supply shortage or a back order problem from the vendor's perspective? What has it been like working as a supplier and trying to navigate back orders with customers?
It's really difficult, especially when you think about some of the critical supplies that have gone on back order for various reasons over the last few years. I think it's really important to have great communication between your on the ground team that's working with the hospitals, providing alternative options. The more you can communicate, the better. But I think it's just Overall, it's just everybody having to really work together to be very thoughtful about what are some alternative options you can use, to be very, I think realistic about what you actually need versus what you actually want when it comes to certain supplies. So it can be a challenge for sure. And then I think the other part of it is you overorder because, you're concerned about availability, and then you end up with all these extra supplies on the back end. And so how do you work through that overstock as well? There's a lot of facets to it.
Yeah. And then that exacerbates the supply shortage problem for everybody else because it's all stockpiled at this one hospital. And I'm sure that that's a frustration that you've had to,
right.
had to navigate as well. It's just wild to think about outside our siloed hospital walls, the trickle effects that supply shortages have. And I imagine working for a supplier, it can be really challenging. And I know in the facility, we have to get really creative whenever there's something that we need and it's all of a sudden had a supply shortage due to a back order or some other reason. And working with a partner that has a panoply of options to be able to get creative with us and provide some other solutions often is the way to go. Tracy, as we move to close this conversation, I want to make sure that we leave our listeners with some concepts that they can implement in their departments to try to make some improvements. The podcast series that we're working through, we've titled Process Better, and we really want people to be able to implement some processes that will help them take care of their supplies well. So if you were working with a client that was dealing with some issues related to backordered supplies, overstocking issues, working with maybe some preference cards that weren't ideal, what recommendations would you have for them to just start their journey towards improvement?
So I think the first thing is to take a step back and look at the bigger picture for your supply chain area, your SPD, OR, and supply chain, and how everybody works together. Who's responsible for what functions? Does your timing make sense? You had mentioned, the picking timeline of case cards. Does it make sense with how you're stocking your supplies in a specific space? Do you have good data to work from? And that's not only preference cards, but also like looking at your item masters. Do you have true visibility to where your items live in the space? And do you have the ability, or does your team have the ability to make informed decisions about the products, the processes, and the workflow? So I usually start there. Like, we take a step back and look at this big picture wise, what is going on and who's doing what. And then I think the next step is then to start looking at places where you can look for training opportunities, maybe make some process changes, and they can be very small, but just things that kind of overall help your teams be more efficient. So we've gone into customers where we've talked about having like separate baskets for hold items versus open items on a case cart, right? Like that can make a big difference when you're the clinician opening supplies in the OR room or in the OR, and just saves time and efforts. Or, things like having like a different colored cone that you put on top of a case cart. So like a green cone would show that the case cart's complete. A yellow cone would say that there's something missing. Those are just little things that you can do that can really have a very positive effect on what the teams are doing. I also think, again, just talking through how you manage expirations, making sure that you have a documentation process so everybody can see what's going on. They know how to document. They understand first in, first out methodologies. Just even having weekly or monthly trainings with staff can really make a big difference, because sometimes you have different departments working and they don't understand what everybody's focus is. And so making sure everyone's aligned and really understanding the ultimate goal, I think, is a really key piece of this as well.
So you've mentioned some responsibilities kind of across the spectrum, whether that's in supply chain and leadership at the technician level, if it's in sterile processing and the OR. It sounds like this would be a pretty collaborative work that needs to get started. Do you find any multifunctional teams getting formed, like task forces around pick lists in hospital and preference cards and case cards and supplies in hospitals? Is that typically how one of these things gets started, is pulling a task force together?
It just depends. I think most often when we get pulled into a facility and asked to help them with workflow and efficiencies, we'll usually find that the two sides maybe are not talking to each other as much as they could. So,
big surprise.
Right? So the clinicians are doing one thing,
yeah.
Supply chain's doing something else. And so we usually try to come in and just, very neutral, party coming in and just looking at overall, where are there some potential gaps? And then how can we potentially work together? The places where we've seen, I think the best improvements when it comes to supply management would be those that have good visibility to their data and really understand the supplies, their item masters, their preference cards. Like that really is the foundation to everything. And then I think secondarily would be having that communication process where the teams are talking to each other, they're working together, and they're really trying to do everything they can to have the most efficient supply processes in their areas.
Sure. So one more thing that I want to make sure that we cover before we wrap here, and this would kind of be the last objection, is people who may be hearing this episode and thinking like, I'm not going to dive in that. I'm not going to break what's not broken. So I'm not going to fix what ain't broke, I think is what I was trying to say.
Right.
So, maybe their preference cards are a mess and maybe their RNs are feeling some protectiveness over that case picking process, and sterile processing doesn't want to get brought into it, and supply chain's happy with its working. And yeah, we've got too many supplies, but at least we're not having back orders, and on and on. There's always a reason for and a justification for the way that kind of our broken processes are the way that they are today. Have you ever tried to quantify in a dollar amount the type of savings that exists in these inefficient, broken processes, and what can really truly be accomplished by taking a hard look at moving supplies through surgery efficiently?
We've had conversations with customers where we've actually been able to show 20% plus savings when you start looking at being more efficient. And that's just in our little portion of, moving supplies around and par optimizing and things like that. It's even greater when you start talking about things like preference cards. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it comes down to money. And you think about if you have inaccurate preference cards, more than likely you're probably not charging correctly at the bedside. So you're missing opportunities for revenue there. And then the other thing is if you're not managing your inventory and you have things expiring. I mean, I've talked to customers who've had, up to $1 million a year in expirations. And they're talking that you think about that loss of revenue. There's so many things that you can do that I think really would have an impact and make just the hospital so much more profitable if they just paid attention to some of these little things.
No doubt. And that's not a crazy number to hear. Conversations that I've had around supply chain improvements often get calculated in the realm of millions per year in terms of improvement. And that takes into account the labor involved, trying to find more efficient processes as well as the cost of the supply. But mind-numbing amounts of money that we're leaving on the table by having these inefficient and broken processes, let alone the concern to having safe and consistent processes for patient safety. So, Tracy, we're about out of time. That was a great conversation to introduce us to this topic of supply management around surgery. Definitely a wealth of knowledge. I love what you all are doing and trying to work directly with customers to help them make sure that patients are taken care of and that the hospital is able to spend those dollars improving patient care and not spending them on expired supplies and the like. So great job on the interview today. Thanks for joining the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Was Tracy Smith, National Market Director at Medline, talking to us about inventory and supply management in the surgical suite. And good grief, it is complex. If you were to do what she was recommending as they work with clients to just get a handle on what it is that every individual in the whole supply chain process is doing, from who's picking what supplies and who's moving to grab what supplies at what time of the day, you might be surprised to find some of the wild workarounds in your department that you've come across, and just underline some of the things that just plain don't make sense. And as we wrapped up thinking about the sheer cost and waste involved in supply chain management sometimes really highlights the need for doing so efficiently. I hope you enjoyed that style of interview, getting into something a little bit different, touching maybe a little bit more into that supply chain, but I know we have some of the more old school central service departments that tune into Beyond Clean here that may be doing the whole shebang themselves, pulling case cart from start to finish and supplying the OR that way. And so I hope you found that to be useful, if not something that you're at least curious about, because one of the reasons that this topic shows up in our CRCST manual and our certification manuals is because even if you're not in that department today, you may very well end up growing in your career and managing one of those departments or moving to another department down the street. So always good to be educated and aware. With that, we're going to wrap it and prepare for our next episode where we're going to do something even a little bit more different as we talk with an instrument quality business developer and thinking about how we source the types of reusable instruments that we buy. Should be a really fascinating interview, so look forward to talking with him next week, and we'll leave you with that teaser. So on behalf of Tracy, myself, and the rest of the Beyond Clean team here, keep fighting dirty. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Process Better. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app, or by downloading the Beyond Clean smartphone app on iPhone or Android. In the app, you can access bonus content for certain episodes and filter episodes by category. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to give us a 5-star rating and review. Your feedback matters and is important to us. We look forward to hearing from you.
Quack.